The second letter arrived on a Tuesday in March of 1968, and his mother set it on the kitchen table unopened, and it stayed there, propped against the sugar bowl, for the next 51 years. Her name was Eleanor, and she was 46 years old when the letter came, and she had already received the other thing 2 weeks earlier, the thing that comes in the form of 2 men in dress uniforms, walking up a front path with their hats in their hands, and their faces arranged into the expression the army teaches them for this exact errand. She had seen them through the screen door. She had known before they reached the porch, the way mothers in that decade learned to know, the way the whole country had learned to read the choreography of a government car slowing in front of a house. Her son Daniel was dead. He had been killed at a place called Khe Sanh, a name she had never heard before the newspapers started printing it, and would never stop hearing for the rest of her life, a red dirt plateau in the far northwest corner of South Vietnam, where in the early months of 1968, 6,000 Marines were surrounded by 20,000 North Vietnamese, and the world held its breath waiting to see if it would become another Dien Bien Phu. Daniel had been 19. He had been at Khe Sanh for exactly 31 days. The first letter had come in February, while he was still alive, and Eleanor had read it so many times that the creases had gone soft as cloth. It was not a remarkable letter. That was the thing she would come to understand only much later, that its unremarkableness was the whole of its terrible value. He wrote about the cold, which surprised him, because he had expected the tropics and gotten a fog-bound plateau where the nights dropped close to freezing. He wrote about a sergeant named Pruitt, who had taken him under his wing. He wrote that the coffee was bad, and the mail was slow, and that he had seen a deer once at the edge of the wire in the grey light before a patrol, and that it had looked at him for a long moment before it walked away, unhurried, as though the war were a thing happening to a different species. He wrote at the end the line she would eventually have carved into the stone: "Don't worry about me, Ma, I'm careful. I'll write again Sunday." He did write again. That was the second letter. He wrote again on Sunday the way he had promised, and the letter went into the slow churning machinery of military mail, the bags flown out of Khe Sanh on the resupply planes that ran the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire to land on the besieged airstrip, and it made its way across the Pacific while its author was still alive, and kept making its way while he was dying, and was somewhere over the ocean, probably in the dark belly of a transport plane, on the day the 2 men in dress uniforms walked up Eleanor's path. The letter and the news crossed somewhere in the air over the world. The news, traveling by official channel, arrived first. The letter, traveling by the ordinary post, arrived 2 weeks later, a voice from a son who was already in the ground at the cemetery on the hill, speaking words he had written when his hand was still warm and his promise still good. And Eleanor could not open it. She tried. She would tell her daughter, decades later, in one of the only conversations they ever had about it, that she had tried that first afternoon, had picked it up and gotten her thumb under the flap, and felt the dried glue begin to give, and had been seized by a terror so total and so physical that she put it down as though it had burned her. Because as long as the letter was sealed, she realized, there was one more thing of Daniel's still coming toward her, one more moment of him still in the future instead of all of him in the past. The unopened letter was the last room in the house where her son was still alive. If she opened it, she would read his last words, and then there would be no more words, not ever, and the supply of Daniel that the universe was going to issue her would be officially, finally, exhausted. So she set it against the sugar bowl, and she left it there. Her husband, Walter, did not understand. He was a practical man, a man who believed that grief was a thing you walked through and came out the other side of, and he thought the letter was morbid, a wound she was refusing to let close. More than once in those first months he offered to read it to her, to open it himself and take that burden from her, and each time she said no with a sharpness that frightened them both, and eventually he stopped offering, and the letter became the thing they did not discuss, the white rectangle on the table that they ate their silent dinners beside, the third presence in a marriage that had lost the second child it had been built around. Because there had been a second child, and now there was only the daughter, Margaret, who was 12 when her brother died, and who grew up in a house organized around an envelope. She would remember her whole childhood in relation to it. The letter was there when she did her homework at that table. It was there at Christmas, propped against the centerpiece. It was there when she brought boys home, and they would glance at it and sense with the animal instinct of teenagers that there was a grief in this house with rules they did not understand, and they did not ask. The envelope yellowed. The ink of the address in Daniel's own handwriting faded from black to brown, and Eleanor dusted around it and never moved it and never opened it, and the family arranged its entire emotional life around the gravitational pull of 3 sentences nobody had read. What none of them knew, what could not have been known for 51 years, was that the second letter did not say what any of them assumed. They all believed, in the unspoken way a family believes things, that it was simply more of the first, another ordinary dispatch, the cold and the coffee and the bad mail. They believed it was precious because it was last, not because it was different. They were wrong. The second letter from Khe Sanh contained something Daniel had never said in any other letter, a thing he had needed to tell his mother and had been able to commit to paper only because he had begun, in his last week alive on that plateau, to understand something about his own odds. It would sit sealed against the sugar bowl through the rest of the war, through the moon landing, through Watergate, through every year of a half-century, waiting, the way the boy in the courtyard waited, the way the watch waited in the drawer, for someone, finally, to be brave enough to break the seal. Eleanor died in the autumn of 2019, at 97, in the same house, in a bed that had been moved down to the parlor because the stairs had become a country she could no longer reach. She died with most of her century behind her, having outlived Walter by 22 years, having outlived nearly everyone who had known Daniel as a living boy rather than a name on a stone. And the letter was still on the table. She had moved exactly once in 51 years to a smaller house in the 70s when Walter's back gave out, and the movers had been given one instruction that superseded all others, delivered by Eleanor in a voice that brooked no clarification: "The envelope on the kitchen table travels with me, in my purse, on my person, and if it is lost, do not bother bringing the rest." Margaret was 63 when her mother died. She had a life by then in a city 3 states away, a marriage, 2 grown children of her own, a career she was winding down. She came home to bury Eleanor and to empty the house, the grim arithmetic of the surviving child, the boxing up of a life, and on the 3rd day, sorting the kitchen, she came to the table, and the letter was there, where it had been every single day of her life, propped against the same sugar bowl, which Margaret now understood her mother must have deliberately kept and replaced over the decades, because no sugar bowl survives 51 years of use, and the realization that her mother had quietly maintained the staging of this grief, had curated it, had kept a prop in service, so the letter would always have something to lean against, undid Margaret more than the funeral had. She picked it up. She was a grown woman, older now than her mother had been when the letter arrived, and she held the thing that had ruled her childhood, and felt its almost weightless heft, the dried-out paper, the ink gone the color of old tea. And she faced the question her mother had faced 51 years before, and answered the opposite way, because Eleanor had needed Daniel to have one more thing in the future, and Margaret needed, with an urgency that surprised her, to finally know her brother, the brother she had been too young to know in life, and had spent 50 years knowing only as an absence shaped like an envelope. She did not open it that day. She understood, holding it, that this was not a thing to be done standing in a kitchen full of packing boxes. It deserved an occasion. It deserved, she felt, to be opened in the presence of the only other people who might have a claim on it, and so she did a thing that would change the story, a thing Eleanor had never thought to do because Eleanor had never wanted the letter read at all. Margaret decided to find out who else was still alive that had been at Khe Sanh with her brother. She decided that before she read Daniel's last words, she would try to understand the place and the people he had written them from. She would open the letter, but she would open it knowing something. It was, she thought, the least she could do for a brother she had failed to know, though she would learn in time that the word failed belonged to no one in this story except the war itself. The name in the first letter was her only thread, Pruitt, the sergeant who had taken Daniel under his wing. Margaret had read the first letter too, many times, the one that was allowed to be read, and she remembered the name the way you remember the few solid facts in a fog. She began to look. It was 2019, and the tools the Saigon Marine never had, and the medic's son had only in their infancy, were now vast and ordinary, and a woman at a kitchen table with a laptop could do in an evening what a government had once declined to do across decades. She searched for Khe Sanh veterans. She found the associations, the reunions, the men who gathered every year to remember the 77 days of the siege, fewer of them now with each gathering, the way these things always thin toward the end. She posted a message. She wrote, "My brother Daniel was at Khe Sanh in early 1968. He mentioned a Sergeant Pruitt who looked after him. My brother was killed there. I am trying to find anyone who knew him." The answer came in 9 days. It came from a man in Tennessee, 81 years old, who had not been Pruitt, because Pruitt, the message explained gently, had been killed at Khe Sanh 3 days after Daniel, in the same stretch of the siege, on the same patch of red dirt. But this man had known them both. His name was Hollis, and he had been a corporal in Daniel's unit, and he had been there, and he remembered the boy. He remembered him specifically. And what he wrote in his second message, after Margaret had established that she was who she said she was, after the careful circling that men of that generation do before they open the door to that particular room, was the thing that turned a story about a letter into a story about a debt. Hollis wrote, "Your brother is the reason I am alive to be writing this. I have wanted to find his family for 51 years, and I did not know how. I did not even know his last name for certain. I have thought about him nearly every day of my life. There is something I need to tell you, and it is not a thing for a letter or a phone. If you will allow it, I would like to come to you, or you to me, and I will tell you what your brother did, and what I have carried because of it." Margaret read it sitting at the same table where the unopened letter still lay, and she understood that she had pulled a thread expecting to learn about a place and had instead pulled loose an entire human being who had been waiting, as long as her mother had been not opening the letter, for the other half of a story to come and find him. Two people on opposite ends of the country had each spent 51 years carrying half of Daniel, and neither had known the other existed, and the letter, still sealed, still leaning, had suddenly become not the end of the story she was about to read, but the beginning of one she had never suspected, because whatever Daniel had written to his mother in his last week, Margaret now knew there was a corporal in Tennessee who could tell her what Daniel had done in that same last week, and that the two accounts, the written and the lived, were about to meet for the first time in half a century. She wrote back within the hour. She said yes. She said she would come. She flew to Tennessee in November, 3 weeks after the funeral, carrying the unopened letter in her purse, exactly as her mother had carried it, which was not a decision so much as an inheritance, her hand having learned the gesture from watching it her whole life. Hollis met her at the airport himself, which his daughter had argued against on account of his heart, and Margaret knew him instantly among the waiting faces, an old man in a pressed shirt holding a hand-lettered sign with her name on it, though they both knew she would recognize him and he would recognize her, the sign less a practical thing than a courtesy, a formality offered to an occasion that both of them understood to be sacred. He took her to a diner first, because some conversations need a table and bad coffee and the permission to look away from each other that a public place provides. And there, over a meal neither of them touched, Hollis told her what he had carried for 51 years. It had been the 3rd week of February, 1968. The siege was at its worst, the plateau under near constant bombardment, the men living in trenches and bunkers dug into the red clay, the airstrip taking fire every time a plane tried to land. Hollis had been 19, like Daniel, 2 boys among the 6,000. They had become close the way you become close in a place like that, fast and total, a friendship compressed by proximity to death into something that would have taken years in the ordinary world. And on a grey morning during a mortar barrage, Hollis had made the mistake that should have killed him. He had been caught in the open, between bunkers when the rounds started walking across the position, and he had frozen, the specific paralysis that takes young men in their first real brush with the end, his body simply refusing the order to move. Daniel had not frozen. Daniel had come out of the bunker after him. He had crossed the open ground under the falling mortars, and he had reached Hollis, and he had not been gentle about it, had grabbed him by the harness, and hauled him bodily across the last 10 yards, and thrown him down into the trench, and landed on top of him, as a round struck close enough that they both felt the heat of it, the concussion of it, driving the air out of their lungs. And when the barrage lifted and they lay there in the red mud, shaking, alive, Daniel had looked at him and grinned, the grin of a 19-year-old who has just done something enormous and does not yet have the architecture to understand it, and had said the thing Hollis would carry to the edge of his own grave. He had said, "You owe me a Coke, Hollis, a cold one, when we get home." 3 days later, Daniel was dead. Not saving anyone, not in a moment of glory, just killed, the way most of them were killed, by a random round that found him where he stood. The arbitrary mathematics of artillery that does not distinguish between the boy who freezes and the boy who runs into the open to save his friend. Hollis had not been there for it. He had been on the other side of the position. He had come back to find the thing already done, Daniel already gone, and he had never, in 51 years, been able to make the two facts sit together in his mind, that Daniel had crossed open ground to save him, and survived, and then had died standing still 3 days later, owed a Coke that would never be paid. "I made it home," Hollis told her, his hands flat on the table to stop them shaking, "because your brother decided I should. He spent some of whatever he had left getting me out of that open ground. 3 days. That's what the math came to. He had 3 days left, and he used part of one of them on me." He looked up at her. "I have had 51 years, Margaret. I got married. I had kids. I have grandkids. I ran a hardware store for 30 years. Every good thing in my life happened in the time your brother bought me, and I never got to tell him, and I never got to tell anybody who belonged to him, because I couldn't find you, and the not telling has been the heaviest thing I ever carried, heavier than anything that happened over there." And then Hollis told her the part that connected back to the letter, the part that closed the circuit. Neither of them had known was open. He said that the night after Daniel pulled him from the open ground, the two of them had sat in the bunker, and Daniel had been quiet, changed, the way a man gets when he has looked at the thing directly. And Daniel had said that he was going to write his mother, not the usual letter, a real one. He had said, Hollis remembered, that he had never told his mother that he understood what it had cost her to raise them after his father's heart trouble started, that he had been a hard kid, a sullen teenager, that he had left for the war with things unsaid because 19-year-olds always believe there will be time. And he had said he was going to fix that. He was going to write it down, because he might not get the chance to say it, and some things a mother should have in writing so she can hold them. He wrote it the next day, Hollis said. I saw him writing it. He told me it was the hardest letter he ever wrote, and the most important, and he was going to mail it Sunday. Hollis stopped. I always wondered if it got to her. I wondered for 51 years whether his mother ever got the thing he stayed up writing, the thing he was so set on her having. And Margaret, who had carried the answer in her purse across the country without knowing she was carrying it, understood at last what the unopened envelope contained. Not more of the cold and the coffee. Not an ordinary dispatch made precious only by being last. The second letter was Daniel's reckoning, the thing he had needed his mother to have in writing, the words a hard boy had finally found in the 1 week of his life when he understood he might run out of time to say them. And it had reached Eleanor exactly as he intended, had arrived safe across the ocean, had completed its impossible journey from the besieged plateau to the kitchen table. And his mother had never opened it. Margaret sat in the diner in Tennessee and wept for the first time since her mother's funeral, wept for all of them at once, for Daniel, who had written the hardest letter of his life and died believing his mother would read it, for Eleanor, who had been so terrified of the last of her son that she had refused the very gift he had spent his final strength to send, for Hollis, who had carried his debt for half a century with no one to pay it to. 3 people, 3 kinds of carrying, and the letter at the center of all of it, still sealed, still in her purse, 6 inches from her hand. She reached for it. And then she stopped, because she understood that this too was not the place. The letter had waited 51 years. It could wait until it could be opened where it belonged, in the presence of the man whose life it had been written alongside, the only other person alive who had been in the room when Daniel decided to write it. They drove out to the cemetery the next morning, the two of them, because Margaret had decided in the night where the letter had to be opened, and Hollis had agreed before she finished asking. It was a 4-hour drive back to the town where Daniel was buried, the town where Eleanor had just been laid beside him, the family plot on the hill that Margaret had stood over 3 weeks before, without knowing that the man in the passenger seat existed. Hollis should not have made the drive. His daughter said so on the phone twice. He made it anyway. He said there were some things a heart was for, and this was one of them, and if it stopped him on the way, then it would stop him doing the only thing he had ever wanted to do since 1968, which was answer to Daniel's family for Daniel's gift, and there were worse ways for an old man's heart to give out than that. The graves were side by side now, the old stone and the new one. Daniel dead at 19 in 1968, and Eleanor dead at 97 in 2019, mother and son separated by 51 years, and reunited under the same patch of grass on the same hill, and on Daniel's stone, worn now by half a century of weather, the line his mother had chosen, the line from the first letter, the only letter she ever let herself read, "Don't worry about me, Ma. I'm careful. I'll write again Sunday." Hollis stood at the foot of the grave of the boy who had bought him 51 years and could not speak for a long time. Then he did the thing he had come to do. He reached into his coat and took out a bottle, an old glass bottle of Coca-Cola, the kind with the contoured glass, ice cold from a cooler he had insisted they stop for, and he opened it there at the graveside with the opener on his keychain, the hiss of it loud in the quiet of the hill, and he poured it out slowly onto the grass over Daniel, the whole bottle, the cold one, owed for 51 years and paid at last. "There," he said, very quietly, to the boy under the ground. "There. I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm sorry it's late. And then, because the dead require the truth or they are not honored but only used. I had a good life. I want you to know that. I didn't waste it. I didn't waste what you gave me." And then Margaret took the letter out of her purse. She had thought about this moment for 3 weeks and across 1,000 miles, and she had decided that she would read it aloud here, to the three of them, to Daniel under the stone and Eleanor beside him and Hollis standing witness, because the letter had been written by one of them and refused by another and explained by the third, and it belonged to all of them and could only be opened in the presence of all of them, which the hill now at last provided. Her hands were steady. She got her thumb under the flap where her mother's thumb had been 51 years before, in the same place, the dried glue giving way at last under a daughter's hand, where it had not been allowed to give under a mother's. She opened the envelope that an entire family had organized itself around for half a century, and she read. It was not long. The most important things rarely are. Daniel told his mother that he was all right, that there was a sergeant named Pruitt looking out for him, and a friend named Hollis he'd made, and at the sound of his own name, read aloud over the grave, the old man put his hand to his mouth and held it there. And then Daniel said the thing he had crossed open ground in himself to reach, the reckoning, the words a hard boy found in his last week alive. He told his mother that he knew what she had given up for him, and Margaret after his father got sick. He told her he had been a difficult son, and that he was sorry for the slammed doors and the silences, and the years he had spent acting as though she were an obstacle, instead of the person holding the whole of their lives together with her 2 hands. He told her she had been the bravest person he ever knew, braver than anyone he was serving with, because they had been trained for their war, and she had been handed hers with no training at all, and had not once put it down. He told her that whatever happened to him, she was not to think she had failed him, because she had given him everything that was good in him, and if he turned out to be the kind of man who could be useful to the men around him, the kind of man worth anything at all, it was her doing, all of it, all the way down. And he closed the letter the way he had closed the first, the same words, except that now Margaret understood. They had never meant what the family thought they meant, had never been a casual sign-off, but a promise made by a boy who already suspected he might not be able to keep it. "Don't worry about me, Ma. I'm careful." And then the last line, the one Eleanor never read, the one that had waited 51 years against the sugar bowl, the line that was different from the first letter, the line he had added because by his last week he had known. "And if I don't write again, know that the last thing I did with my life I would do over, every time. I love you, Daniel." Margaret finished, and the hill was silent. and the only sound was an old man weeping at the foot of a grave, the friend who had finally heard, 51 years late, that the boy who saved him had gone to his death at peace with it, had written it down, had wanted it known. Eleanor had been so afraid that the last of her son would be unbearable, that she had never learned it was the opposite, that the letter she could not open was not the end of Daniel, but the whole of him, the best of him, his absolution of her offered freely from a trench in the worst place on earth. She had guarded it for 51 years as a wound. It had been the entire time a gift. Margaret had it framed, the letter and the envelope both, and she did not put it back on a kitchen table to be a grief. She hung it in the light, where it could be read, and beside it she hung the only photograph Hollis had of the two of them, two grinning boys in the red dirt, who did not yet know which of them would get to grow old. Hollis lived 2 more years. He came to visit the grave each spring, and each spring he poured out a cold one over the grass, and the two families became, the way these things sometimes do, a single thing, grafted at the place where one boy's courage met another boy's survival. He wrote one letter home from Khe Sanh, and his mother never opened the second. But the words did not die with her refusal, and the boy did not die unspoken, because a debt walked out of Tennessee 51 years later to meet a letter walking out of a purse, and the two halves of him, the written and the lived, finally found each other on a hill, and were read aloud, and were heard. The country had a way of letting its sons fade into names on stones. This one at least got his whole self said out loud at last, over his own grave, in his mother's voice carried by his sister's mouth, to the one man left alive, who had been there to hear him promise a cold Coke on a morning. He ran into the open, and chose, with 3 days left, to spend one of them on a friend,